HBO's excellent drama Rome portrays the fall of the Roman Republic and the rise of the empire, and it's one of the rare historical dramatizations that actually achieves its ambitions. The series remains memorable nearly 2 decades after its conclusion thanks in large part to its characters. Not only are key historical figures like Caesar, Augustus, and Cicero portrayed as authentic, complex, and flawed human beings, the show is also full of fascinating original characters, who often manage to steal the spotlight from some of the central figures of Western history. Many fans of the show have a soft spot for the town crier, or praeco, wonderfully portrayed by Ian McNeice. Praeco's willingness to read pretty much anything handed to him by whichever faction controls Rome at the time makes his character a biting commentary on the malleability of mass media. But despite his amorality, the rhetorical stylings and sublime hand gestures of the praeco endeared him to fans forever. Whether reading political announcements or bulletins for runaway slaves, a recurring motif is an end-of-segment ad read for the Guild of Millers. We are regularly told that the Guild of Millers uses only the finest grains, true Roman bread for true Romans. We don't know if such sponsorships existed, much less what they would have sounded like. But it seems to challenge our conception of the sophisticated forebears of Western civilization that they may have been won over by such shameless nativism. After all, a commonly held belief about the ancient Romans is that, despite building an empire that enslaved and dominated subject peoples, Romans didn't ascribe to attitudes that meet the modern definition of racism. We're told that their particular brand of exploitation and enslavement was economic in nature and not driven by an inherent bigotry. After all, even the lowest slave could potentially achieve freedom, and then their freeborn children would be able to climb the ladder of Roman society as full equals to other plebeians. The shining example is the Emperor Pertinax, who rose from son of a former slave all the way to Emperor of Rome. These arguments are largely true, but they miss a more important point by conflating slavery and racism as one and the same. For the Romans, the two aren't connected. But a Gallic father watching his children dragged into slavery to satisfy the whims of a Roman magistrate likely wouldn't have been satisfied to know that their future owners held no prejudices against the Gallic race. Rome's exploitation was inexcusable on any grounds, even if it was not driven by racist ideology. And even if a fraction of slaves were able to achieve freedom and their children had the ability to eventually integrate into the bottom rungs of society, we must not fall into the view that because slavery was widely accepted in the ancient world, it was any less evil than the barbarism of modern slavery. But Roman racial attitudes often don't meet modern definitions of racism, precisely because modern terminology was developed to describe modern problems. We must remember that more than simple bigotry, racism is an ideology, a system of thought and action. Racism plays on deep-seated human fears of the other to categorize humans into arbitrary divisions and then marginalize particular groups, making it easier to justify their exclusion from full participation in society, the denial of their rights, and even violence towards them. The birth of modern racism can be traced somewhat paradoxically to the Enlightenment era. Prejudice and racialized thinking certainly already existed and animated bigoted attitudes in every recorded society, just as they did in ancient Rome. But it was the advent of science as a supposedly objective arbiter which allowed for races to be classified into pseudo-taxonomies. The emerging concept of race was used to categorize humans into hierarchies. This self-serving intellectual exercise cast the rational European in opposition to the supposedly inferior races of colonized people. It's what allowed a man to sing creeds of universal love and harmony on Sunday morning, but then leave the church to abuse human beings he regarded as his own property. Racism was a crutch that allowed these opposing ideas to be reconciled, a willful self-deception that all of the evils being perpetrated were somehow actually for the benefit of the oppressed. Because the superstructure of ideology so often follows the base economic conditions of a society, we shouldn't be surprised at how closely the emergence of scientific racism followed the rise of proto-capitalism, European colonialism, and the transatlantic slave trade. As European powers built intercontinental empires, they brutally subjugated and enslaved people of different ethnicities, requiring the development of new ideologies to rationalize these practices, despite their professions of universal brotherhood and equality before God. So while Romans had a brutally exploitative empire of their own, and their intensely hierarchical society was entirely dependent on slave labor, they never created a false theory of arbitrary racial qualifications and hierarchies. They simply lacked the language. But it's also important to reflect on the fact that these twisted modes of thought weren't developed precisely because they weren't necessary. In the ancient world, the prevailing moral theory was still some variation of might makes right. Or, in the words of the Athenians at the Siege of Melos, the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. It isn't just that the Romans had no cultural inclination toward the equality of all men. The dominant Aristotelian philosophy of the day directly countered this idea that we now take for granted. Since there was no need to respect the inherent rights of fellow men, the Romans never depended on a theory of benevolent racial paternalism to justify exploitation and violence as somehow to the benefit of those being oppressed. Had there been widespread cultural values that demanded they acknowledge all men as equals, the Romans would not have hesitated to create a fully fledged theory of immutable racial categories that placed themselves at the apex of human civilization. The Romans were a pragmatic people, so they were always willing to shift the contours of their official ideologies when conditions demanded it. The actual ideology of the Roman state and the majority of its people, the one that evolved to fit the economic needs of the upper class, could better be described as an elastic form of bigotry that was deeply prejudiced toward groups that were defined as other more by their cultural, religious, and linguistic characteristics than their racial composition. The adoption of Roman cultural practices could make anyone into a Roman eventually, regardless of racial background. Because prejudice was more cultural than anything else, the bigotry Romans expressed toward others doesn't necessarily meet the modern definition of racism. Furthermore, Roman beliefs never really translated individual prejudices to become an ingrained ideology that normalized and perpetrated the unequal distribution of power, resources, and opportunity along racial lines. That's not to say they weren't bigoted. Cicero is commonly viewed as the most sophisticated thinker Rome produced. But in reality, he exemplified the regressive racial attitudes present among the elite during the late Republic, notably in his admiration of Greek culture, but antipathy toward the Greeks themselves. In fact, Cicero's writings are the first evidence we have of the racial slur Graeculus, which is often translated as Greekling. However, scholars believe that he did not originate the term and that the slur was likely used across Roman society to denigrate Greeks and justify their subjugation, despite Romans readily admitting the superiority of Greek culture. But Cicero's prejudice was not just limited to Greeks. For example, he refused to represent the people of Sardinia in their extortion case against a former governor, citing their ancient blood ties to Carthage, a comment that's hard not to read as racial in character. Cicero also made negative comments about the Jews of Rome and even had some somewhat xenophobic beliefs about the non-Roman peoples of Italy, supporting a law that purged citizens from Latin and Italian communities. If such prejudices existed with intellectuals like Cicero, we should be less surprised to see them reflected in simple-minded conservative ideologues like Cato the Elder. While other Romans appreciated Greek culture and dismissed the Greeks themselves, Cato waged a futile war against any Greek influence in Rome, despising Hellenic philosophers and even doctors. Greeks are a most iniquitous and intractable race, and you may take my word as the word of a prophet when I tell you that whenever that nation shall bestow its literature upon Rome, it will mar everything, and that all the sooner if it sends its physicians among us. They have conspired among themselves to murder all barbarians with their medicine, a profession which they exercise for lucre in order that they may win our confidence and dispatch us all the more easily. They are in the common habit, too, of calling us barbarians and stigmatize us beyond all other nations by giving us the abominable appellation of opici. I forbid you to have anything to do with physicians. Anti-Greek sentiment survived the fall of the Republic and persisted into the Empire. Romans as diverse as Juvenal, Pliny, Tacitus, Florus, and Trajan all used the slur Graeculus to impugn the Hellenic people. Like Greeks, Jews were also treated by Romans with both admiration and disdain. Romans respected the antiquity of their religion and culture, but never quite came to terms with the distinctness of Jewish identity. So while Julius Caesar and Augustus were both tolerant and even respectful of Rome's Jewish minority, this accepting attitude would soon dissipate as emperor worship became more central to the Roman state religion. In 19, Tiberius ordered that all Jews be expelled from Rome. His successor Caligula would strain Roman-Jewish relations to the breaking point by insisting that a statue of himself as a god be installed in the Jerusalem temple, even ordering that this be carried out by violent means if necessary. Though the crisis was averted at the very timely death of Caligula, it highlighted the growing separation between both parties, and few could have been surprised at the outbreak of war a few decades later in 66. In total, 3 wars were fought between Rome and the Jewish people, culminating in the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132. Despite some Jewish successes, Rome won all 3 and treated the conquered with unprecedented savagery, even placing restrictions on aspects of Jewish religious practice that altered the religion forever. Rome's toleration only extended to those that followed its decrees. Though these are the 2 best attested communities that were subject to prejudice by the Romans, we must note that there were many more examples of people facing bigotry for their national background. For example, Pliny is recorded mocking the dark skin of a well-known boxer of mixed Roman and African descent. But in keeping with a bigotry that placed greater emphasis on social position than ethnic heritage, the harshest language was always reserved for slaves, no matter their background. This shouldn't be surprising, as ideology demanded slaves be viewed as lesser humans so that the Romans could feel justified holding them in bondage. Cassius Longinus described the Eastern-born slaves in Rome as the scum of other nations, but few could match Augustus in the hatred of the enslaved. During his reign, he displayed consistent commitment to placing as many barriers as possible between the enslaved and Roman citizenship for their descendants. His policies were born out of his desire to protect what he viewed as the purity of the Roman people from the intermingling of slave heritage. For a man obsessed with fighting off demographic decline and as committed to increasing the number of Romans as Augustus, this practice really only makes sense if the first emperor adopted an attitude of inherent Roman racial superiority that was mostly alien to his countrymen. Considering it of great importance to keep the people uncorrupted by any taint of peregrine or servile blood, Augustus conferred Roman citizenship sparingly and put a limit on manumissions. When Tiberius sought citizenship for a Greek dependent of his, Augustus replied that he would not grant it unless the man appeared in person and showed cause for the grant. These examples of bigoted thinking were at their root methods of justifying the perpetuation of a tiered social system that only recognized the full humanity of those at the top. The farther down one fell on the pyramid, the more their humanity was denied. Fortunately, as the empire became more and more cosmopolitan, significant strides were made in rooting out prejudice. Emperors like Claudius and Nero showed more tolerance and generosity toward outside communities, granting them more rights and opportunities. However, these rights were always precarious and could be clawed back at the whims of future emperors. The vision of a cosmopolitan Rome culminated in the Constitutio Antoniniana of Caracalla in 212, which granted universal citizenship to all free men in the entire empire. Though this was a triumph for the universalist vision of Rome, it left women no better off and did nothing to improve the standing of the enslaved. True universalism was still some ways off. The most visionary Roman thinker on this subject prior to Christianity was the Stoic philosopher Seneca, who advocated a stunningly universalist vision of the world that recognized the shared humanity of all people. He pushed back against the worst aspects of Roman society and even directly denounced racism. The color of the Ethiopian is not something to be specially noticed. Nothing is odd or disgraceful for an individual if it is characteristic of his whole nation. Though he spoke in favor of the enslaved, Seneca's moral blinders left him unable to condemn the institution of slavery. Still, he shows us that even within a morally stunted society, Bigotry is not natural or inevitable, but a historical and ideological construct that can be challenged and transformed. We are all products of our societies, conditioned to view the injustices that surround us as inherent to reality itself. But like Seneca, we can rise above these limitations and create a more just world. We'd like to extend our deepest thanks to our channel members who make Tribunate possible. Arturo Fiquis, A Chewed Up Loafer, BC, Captain Miller 44, Esoteric Dime, Coril, Patch 712, Seraphianus, Socialism, and Uncle Eckley.
Hi, Gaius here. Thanks for being part of our efforts to shed light on the more obscure topics related to the fascinating world of the ancient Romans. If you enjoyed Titus's work here, please do us a favor by liking and subscribing. Gratias vobis ago.